So this is a story that's an excerpt from my novel, Aurelia Lorca and the Flamenco Time Machine, a Monterey Gothic. It's called The Cypress Tree. It was published in 2015 in Joe Donahue's Special Species magazine, and thought it'd be a good day to read it in honor of Langston Hughes's birthday. The Cypress Tree. The branches of the giant cypress tree on the corner of Ocean View and Lighthouse Avenue were like the stiff and green outstretched fingers of a firm hand. Many on Cannery Row walked across the cypress tree, but never under. If you walk across it, fine, Maria Valdez told her sons. But if you walk under it, you get cinco, 5 fingers to the face. For the cypress tree was a footbridge as well as a blanket for the beds of bums who slept off their drink during the daytime or night. The thick-fingered branches shielded the weary from sun or rain. Under the tree was a dark place of stale dirt, booze, urine, and leftover glass jars smelling of yeast and hops. The men who slept there were puffy-faced, with fat hands, swollen bellies, and thin legs. Some of them wore flappy sorts of hats and had buttons missing on their jackets. They carried dusty sacks and had matted hair. They were what no one wanted to be. They were the ones everyone thought had given up. Whenever the writer saw his reflection in the mirror, he saw a bum, a red, pockmarked face, old acne scars, and a puffy belly. But he could not give up. His mother had just died. She never said the words, but his father did. You're a failure. Nonetheless, he could not give up. Whenever his wife kicked him out, or he kicked himself out and could not stay with friends, the writer would sleep under the cypress tree with the bums. Sometimes, if he was drunk enough, he would drink with them and attach an empty cup to a stick with a little sign that said, "Prohibition is over, accepting donations." The writer came from a good family. He lived in their cottage in Pacific Grove. He was supposed to have finished college, make something of himself. But there was nothing inside of this writer besides the word that came from a thing and turned into the word and back into thing again, while he scratched his head and wondered where he went. At first he thought it a golden handcuff of dream. Imagination was the only defense against impermanence. But when he wondered where he began, he could not find anything other than home, the river, the valley, and the stars. His emptiness was constant. He thought at one point that legend might hold some remedy for his condition, so he remembered the stories his mother read to him that the poets had long recycled. He dreamt of gaining the world in his stories to fill the empty places inside of himself. He drank too much, screamed at his wife, and then sobbed under the cypress tree, disappeared into the dirt, and felt at peace. May Day morning, the writer woke from under the cypress tree and wiped the sleep from his eyes. It was a Friday afternoon. Children were playing on top of the branches, sprinkling dusty needles down to the inhabitants below. The writer had a poetry reading to go to over the hill in Carmel. His wife wanted them to go. He would go. Other writers would be there. He often had thoughts that no one other than the artists were ever meant to live in Carmel. It was a place for art, for artifice. Even the forest was artifice, man-made, not planted by nature, but by man. There was an eighth note carved into the mountain across from the turn for the valley road. The boars were black and rumored to run wild in the valley. But in the town, there were thatched ferry houses named after gardens. The other houses were built for show and had large windows to ocean, fog and rock and hawk and what really was. The beach had white sand, chopping waters with waves confident in green underbelly. The air was often damp and sticky. Fog hung around the man made forest in fluffy clumps. There were no clouds, just mist that painted the natural onto artifice. The poet's stone tower was gray against blue, only the colors were real, filaments of truth against contrived time. Carmel was a place he enjoyed visiting, but never for more than a day. The theater where the poetry reading was held had an outside stage encircled by pine trees. It made the writer nervous. It was not a natural circle of trees. Standing on the stage was the poet who wrote of a blues he needed to hear. Love is like whiskey. Love is like wine. If you want to be happy, you got to love all the time. The writer and his wife were among the first to arrive. They sat quietly in seats that were arranged like the pews of a church. He hoped the poet would read under the pines that blues he needed to hear. Love is like whiskey, love is like wine. If you want to be happy, you gotta love all the time. Though he organized the reading, the poet would not be reading his own work. The poet had asked him if he wanted to read something, but he told him no, he could not. It was a May Day reading. It was going to be political, about the labor unrest that was brewing in the factories and the fields. He was not ready yet. He was too angry. His wife told him he should read, get himself out there, but he was too angry. I want to be a writer, he had said, not a journalist. I'm too angry. Once he said the words, he knew that they were not enough. He had once been a journalist. His wife was a journalist. I'm too angry. I want to write political stories that go beyond propaganda. I want to go into the mythic. I want to transcend my anger. I'm not ready yet. The other poets and writers arrived, and the writer felt a burning in his gut. He should be home writing. But they were all there, the blues poet, the poet with the wooden leg carved into a unicorn, the legendary muckraker, the muckraker's wife. The poet of the tower was conspicuously absent. Of course he would not be there. He had better things to do. The earth was greater than the people in it. Writer felt ashamed. He should be home writing. The poet of the tower's wife was there, but not the poet. The writer looked at his wife, her shoulders tensed as the poet of the tower's wife walked in from the trees. The poet of the tower's wife would be reading, not her own work or her husband's work. His wife had introduced him to the poet of the tower's poems. She came bursting into the door of his friend's laboratory, holding a book of his poetry. It was a cold day, but her cheeks were flushed and pink. You have to read this, she said to him and his friend. Both of you, you have to hear this poem. It's California, and it's more than California. It's the state with the made-up name. It's the land and man and woman, the masculine and the feminine. California is a woman. The readers were gathering. They were scraggly but elegant. They were a scraggly but elegant lot that made the writer panic. He should be home. He should be writing. Who was he? Who was he to be there? What a murdering of the time. 1 page a day. He had long abandoned the idea of finishing 1 page a day. Someday something would happen. The reading was as political and filled with rhetoric as the writer thought it would be. The poetry was violent and crafted. It was meant to provoke. He could not decide if it was art or propaganda. If it is meant to provoke, is the art then lost? He whispered to his wife. Is in conveying the message not an invasion of art, but art? His wife said back in his ear. There was an urgency. The world had a hungry mouth. They were all depression bastards amid a legacy of 40 million gas masks. The earth needed to rise rock upon rock. They had not enough time. They had an eternity. It made his heart hurt. When the old silent screen actress read Mary Shelley's or Percy Shelley's Mask of Anarchy, the entire crowd cheered. The writer wanted to hear the poet read the blues. He did not get to hear the blues, but he saw them in all of their faces and in the trees of the man-made forest. As the fall of 1933 gave way to winter of 1934, Viola did not want the longest nights of the year to be so long. She wrote her friend in California how she searched her loneliness for fire blossoms, but only found the waxing and waning moon of regret glowing in her window at 2:45 a.m. Once upon a time, a mermaid had given her love to a young mortal man, and all that was left of her was foam, without voice, without memory. She wrote. She was supposed to be married to a poet. Work is bourgeois, her fiancé had said. A child will only sabotage my manuscript. Put it in your mouth then. Do you have a problem putting things in your mouth? My last lover never had problems putting things in her mouth, he had said. You're not a real intellectual, he had said. You're just a school teacher, a school teacher, a school teacher, he had said. But she never wanted to be anything but love, so she broke off the engagement. She wrote to her friend how 7 nectarines and strange star-pointed fruit itch wildly in between wedges of lemon and orange in small bowls. Those were her dreams. Her nightmare was her truth. Her womb has developed a rash that would never recover. The loneliness left her desolate in red bar rooms and a blues so strong and drunk she could not even spell strong. This is the St. Louis blues, she wrote. It is blue, it is red, and it is angry. She wrote how she wanted to float into the river, float into something, to disappear, disappear. All she hoped to dream about was how to disappear while the smug kept on being pleased with themselves, leaving misery for the rest of them. During the day at work, her students made her want to remain alive, but each night was unbearable. She couldn't change what went on outside of her classroom. St. Louis had never seemed as segregated or as ugly. Her teaching position would end after the Christmas holiday. Viola sat inside mirrors of barrooms until last call and wrote letters to her friend about her broken engagement and her broken womb while wishing she could disappear like the hangover she had from her dreams. She drank from chalices of loneliness and sad blossoms tumbling down the vines like tears. Love was like whiskey, she wrote, like a sweet red wine, she wrote, and she wanted to drink and drink. But it was her dream, her dream, her dream, her friend wrote back. She was Viola, Viola, Viola. The women had been college roommates. Maxine and her husband, a school teacher and a Californian, had lived in Carmel for 2 years. They married after Maxine finished college. Viola was always bolder, tearing off on the last toot and taking Maxine with her. Viola taught Maxine how to smoke, but it was Maxine who moved west and convinced her old friend to come out too. She could get her a job at the library across the street from where she taught school in New Monterey. I teach the children of the cannery workers, Maxine said. Most of them are immigrants, hence my study of Romance languages comes in handy. The stink is awful, but the scenery makes up for it. Maxine promised the ocean would make Viola forget all heartache. She wanted her best friend to live with her on the beach in the artist town, her best friend named after her favorite Shakespearean heroine. Maxine did not want her to be alone. She wanted her to be safe. When Viola first read about the reading, she was shocked. I never thought I would see his name in the local newspaper, Viola told Maxine. I nearly dropped the paper and my cigarette and lit the house on fire. He is here in California, the poet of the blues in California, and he will be reading in Carmel? In Carmel? He's been here off and on for a while, Maxine said with a wry smile. I wrote you about this. Vincent is sometimes here too. Her favorite poet is the one who lives in the stone tower. I have even seen Duke Ellington walking on the beach. They all have the same patron, who is not a New Yorker but a Californian. Oh my God. I told you that you'd like it here. You see, only 5 months and you found a poetry reading you want to go to and a cause to join. He is a Missourian. I'm a Missourian. You're a Vassar girl, Maxine said, handing her friend a cigarette. It was nice to see Viola finally come alive. And now you're a Carmelite. That makes me sound like a nun. Anyway, the reading is on a Friday in the evening. The library closes at 7. Can you cover me? I have to go to that reading. Viola dressed carefully in light gray. She did not dare wear lipstick or perfume. She did not smoke any cigarettes. She did not want to appear too colorful or too somber. She did not want to be noticed. Most of the poets who read lived on the West Coast. She did not recognize any names except for his. and the silent screen actress who once said all women really wanted was a home, and the poet with the wooden leg who was legendary at Vassar because he had a poem that had once beaten Renaissance in a contest. It did not matter to Viola that the poet did not read his own work. It was enough to at long last hear his voice, the careful, almost shy way he enunciated each word, each syllable of Mayakovsky's poetry, hesitating but with conviction. More than politics, Viola decided that the entire reading was about the wild blues of the world. He sounded and looked as beautiful as she had imagined. Maybe it was the fog or the trees, but his skin and his voice seemed golden. I'm like a skitty schoolgirl, she later told Maxine. I got to hear him, finally. Were you able to talk with him? Maxine asked. Get his autograph? Psh, no, I was too shy. Come on, ask for his autograph. You're ridiculous. You know, if you want to talk to him, I hear that he spends a great deal of time on Carmel Beach in the late afternoon, taking his patron's dog for a walk. Really? How do you know these things? It's a small town, word travels. 6 days after the reading, the fishermen, none of whom were in attendance, were demanding more wages. Though Viola read the headlines, she did not make any connections. Upon Maxine's urging, Viola left the library early just to catch him. From the top of the beach, he was just another man riding near the shore with a giant German shepherd. Of course he was riding. He would be riding, she thought. He did not see her approach. The dog stood up, cocked his head to one side. All her life, she had an unwavering fear of dogs. The German shepherd was a particularly massive beast with alert eyes and a black shiny nose. Yet all that existed was the poet, his notebook, the blinding white sand of the beach, the dog and his erect territorial ears in her trembling hands. She had only this moment. She gulped. Excuse me, she said. He looked up and squinted, put his hand over his eyes. She was standing in the sun. He was not glaring at her. Of course he would not glare at her, she thought, even though she was disturbing him. A poet who wrote the poems he wrote would not glare at her. Everything came out in a gush. There was not enough time for manners. Poetry made me want to become a teacher. I wanted to pass along to my students what made me come alive. I think you, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman are the holy trinity of American poetry. He did not move his hand from his eyes. She was still standing in the sunlight. He did not speak. It was low tide. The dog sat back down and curled his massive paws under his body. How old are you? He asked her. I'm 22. I just graduated from Vassar. The poet smiled and went back to his writing. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry for bothering you. She walked back up the hill. Her feet were unsteady and shaking in the sand. She should have taken off her shoes, she thought. She should have told him what his poetry meant to her personally, but she did not know where to begin, and that wasn't how she was taught to talk about poetry. It was never supposed to be personal. She had done everything wrong. At the top of the hill, she turned around. He was still writing in his notebook. A month later, after the articles appeared in the Carmel Sun and the Carmel Pinecone, his strange response and distance made sense. It was not her. He must have known trouble was going to happen. Viola tore both newspapers into pieces after she read the articles. This is ugly, Viola said. They ran him out of town, Maxine. I heard they broke the windows to his patron's cottage. He was afraid for his life. The newspapers didn't report that. All because of a poetry reading? A poetry reading in a civic organization? This place is no different than St. Louis. An isolated incident, Maxine said. Red hysteria because of the strikes. Carmel is not like this. Carmel was founded by artists. It's an artist town. No, this is Jim Crow ugly. You think just because of the pretty beaches and it's California that bigotry doesn't exist? Tell that to the native Ohlonies who built the emission. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but this is unusual for Carmel. You leave Monterey when school is over. I am at the library until 7 p.m. Let me tell you, New Monterey is as segregated as St. Louis, just with different ethnicities. The bigotry is there, and the threat of violence is there if people step out of place. But that's Monterey, not Carmel. It's pervasive. Carmel is not just an artist colony anymore. It's magenta. Not really angry as red, not really sad as blue, but somewhere in between, with a white, beautiful beach and a lot of white tourists. Maxine took out 2 cigarettes and gave one to her friend. Viola did not need to explain any further. She understood. Maybe so, Maxine said. But what can we do? Except to try and be happy. When the writer read the articles, he went into a rage. So they fancy themselves patriots, he said to his wife, with sharp teeth and little testicles. Fucking bastards. He held up both papers and sneered. The American Legion recently opened in response to reports of suspicious activities by the John Reed Club and a black communist sympathizer cavorting with white women. The veterans of that town are drunks. When the hell did they become patriots? And so what if he hugged a white woman at the post office? Such a greeting is normal for friends. Who in the hell cares if he's been balling the muckraker's wife? Her husband's half in the grave. Do they think she's supposed to just dry up because he's married to a fossil? I've met him. I've met his patron, and I can tell you that's who he's most likely balling. The writer's wife wanted to laugh, but she knew the rage would only grow. What the fuck is wrong with that town? The biggest problem they once had were the nudists, and now they're complaining about this? And in front of the post office? His wife continued to try and stifle a laugh, but it came out as a snort. Please, refrain from probing any satirical symbolism or wry discussions of fate, he told his wife, confusing her snort. There is no symbolic destiny about a village that prohibits mailboxes. What the fuck is wrong with that town? It began as an artist colony. The mission is crumbling. There is no room for piety. We never had to restrain ourselves amid the nudists, the women's with men's name, and old poets who have wooden legs carved into the shape of unicorns. No one cared. No one questioned. It would be in poor taste. The writer waved the newspapers in the air, threw them down on the ground, unzipped his pants, and urinated, whipping the stream back and forth to hit both of the offending articles in an angry hiss. The room then smelled of piss and wet newspaper. Communist sympathizer? Jack fucking London lived in Carmel. He was one of the town's founding fathers and more of a patriot than these assholes. And he was a bigot too. Regardless, what the fuck is wrong with these people? Carmel began as an artist colony, for Christ's sakes. For artists, not drunken, blow-hearted, narrow-minded veterans who had never picked up a paintbrush or a pen. The true patriots of that town are the artists. The writer grabbed his wife by the shoulders. The moment had arrived. She no longer was laughing. Ironic. There, I have said it for you. Oh, yes, do tell how all paradises will be lost if they are ever found in the first place. And yes, invariably, spoilers will come and steal the goddamn gold pan of the innocent. Thus, it is cruel, cruel, cruel. It is trite, hackneyed, ridiculous, but I see no humor. Go ahead and jest that all this, all politics aside, was inevitable, cliched, and comical. I say this, fuck them all. They can all fuck off. The writer let go of his wife's shoulders. He knew his breath had been sour and hot in her face. It was not fair. He was still, the words fuck off were still hanging in the air when he slammed the door and left the house. He needed a drink. He needed to sleep under the cypress tree and disappear into the dirt.